No, it's absolutely. Would you? Taking a score for a few moments ago.
Okay, I suppose it all happened in a very hot summer of 2003 when I was actually working on a project in Blackpool. My boss, Paul, came out of a meeting room and said, "Look, Tom, we're going to go for the Olympic competition well, in a way it was a competition to try and win the privilege of then trying to win the bid for London." So that's really how it started. My firm, actually at the time, was currently EDOR, so we decided to go for the bid. And you know, by building really a team around us, we didn't have all the skills ourselves, so we built a consortium for go for the competition, and we won that competition. It was a very, very creative and interesting team. It was made up of ourselves, Allies and Morrison, Foreign Office Architects, HOK Sport, Borough Happold, to name a few. There was a lot of other sort of consultants involved as well. Fluid were involved in terms of consultation. So it was a very, very big team, but it was, we quickly realised that we couldn't do it on our own, and we needed to sort of surround ourselves with very, very skilled, you know, great quality consultants, so that's what we did. It was a bit of a roller coaster ride, really. We won the competition. We had, I think, one of the reasons that we won the competition is that we looked at the Lee Valley, or the lower Lee Valley as a whole, as a regeneration piece, and we didn't just go in. We actually went beyond the brief in some ways. We didn't just go in there with a, you know, here's an Olympic master plan. We said legacy was the ultimate goal here. How can we lever as much regeneration out of the Olympics as possible? But we also gave them a master plan if we didn't win the Olympics. So it's three plans really, which were the things that that helped us win that. As soon as we did win it, we realised that the task was enormous. We had to look at the whole Lower Lee Valley and put the Olympics in that somewhere. We weren't given the boundary that the Olympics is in now. We were given a much greater boundary to understand, and we also, in our style, really started to look at the whole wider area, so almost the whole of East London really, and see how the whole thing would work within that broader part of London. Our brief was not as detailed as probably a lot of people might think it would be. I mean, it really was win the Olympic Games to London somehow. We realised pretty quickly that the UK had a pretty bad reputation at the time for delivering big projects. They were coming in over budget. The planning process in this country was seen to be a big hurdle. It was laborious, long-winded, full of politics, and the fact that we had, you know, this site, which is actually straddling 4 boroughs, just added to that complexity. So we came to the conclusion we had to put a planning application in before the actual bid, so that we could give the IOC confidence that we really could deliver this in this planning environment. So that was sort of one of our, you know, what we suggested. They said, yeah, okay, go for it. So we put one of the biggest planning applications in the country together in 6 months. It became a larger kind of regeneration piece for, I wouldn't say the whole of East London, but for the kind of the whole Lower Lee Valley area. So not only the valley itself, but deep within the sort of surrounding neighbourhoods as well. So that formed sort of planning guidance ultimately. Well, I mean, on a project of this scale, you've got to realise that I wasn't really that involved in the contractual side of things. However, I was very interested in it. So we used NEC3. The main reason for that is there is a relatively clear change order process involved in that. Compensation events, they're called. Because we didn't have a particularly clear brief, it meant that there was a relatively clear process when, you know, brief changes came along. So it was a moving feast really. So I think the contract's form worked pretty well. That was to all boroughs. So at the time it was very complex. We had all 4 boroughs, Waltham Forest, Newham, Tower Hamlets and Hackney. So we actually had 4 rooms for the determination day, where we had to go in there, and one by one we got a yes, yes, yes. I think the last one was Hackney. Left everyone hanging on slightly, but so that was the kind of process, and from that point Obviously, once we won the bid, we began to realise that just we couldn't work in that condition anymore. So all 4 boroughs got together to form a sort of joint planning committee group. So yeah, first we had to go for the competition, the architectural competition, to win the privilege of then going for the bid for London effectively. So we did that through delivering 3 master plans as opposed to just one for Olympics, one for legacy, which we felt was very important in terms of levering as much as we could from the Olympic Games for East London, for London, for regeneration. And then also another master plan for what happens to this area if we don't win, because it was still an amazing area of London that needed looking at. Once we then had a fantastic day when we actually won the competition, we then had to get to work on how do we win the bid for London, because in a way that was our brief. It was a very loose brief, just win it for London and try and get as much into the legacy as you possibly can. So the consortium came together through people that we knew, people that we liked to work with, people we respected. So, Foreign Office, Allies and Morrison, HOK with all their sports know-how, and then Borough Happel, arguably one of the best engineers in the country. So they, we gathered together, and I think a lot of these things work via personalities. They're not, you can put as many processes in place as you like, but it's really down to the people on the ground delivering this. So we very quickly realised in order to deliver a plan application in 6 months, we had to work very, very closely together. So we co-located in an old Allies and Morrison office in central London. So the core team was there. There were other people who were doing work outside of that, but the core design team was in there. So I was kind of leading a lot of the EDOR work. Obviously we had a senior group that made decisions and met every Monday morning at 8 o'clock, I think, when we had to kind of get everything together and present, and then decisions were made and the whole thing moved forward. But having engineers, other architects, sports architects under one roof, just literally within 5 metres of my desk, meant that I could make, we could meet on an ad hoc basis and make decisions and move forward very, very quickly. So it's something that's very unique and something that we continue to carry on as an idea all the way through the project. Well, again, the planning application, we realised that the planning application was going to be very important because of in a way, the history of Britain and UK delivering big infrastructure projects. We were pretty poor at it. We were coming in over budget on a lot of big infrastructure projects. The planning system was seen as a very sort of laborious, long-winded, political, difficult process to navigate through. So we, in order to try and dispel that issue to the IOC, we realised that we had to put, we wanted to put a planning application in before the bid to really show our intent and show that that we can actually do that. So we quickly decided that an application not only for Olympics but also for legacy was very, very important. So and that was something again that we took on as an idea that ran through the whole project. You always have the Olympic plan and you always have the legacy plan next to it. And always compare the two to see where there are opportunities to bring through that investment in the games through into legacy. So the applications, I think we turned around in 6 months. One of the difficult aspects there was the fact that we had 4 boroughs to deal with, so we actually had to put the application in to each borough separately, and determination was done through each separate borough as well. But luckily, they all accepted it. So that was a great win for us, and that was accepted before the actual bid. The bid of London getting the games was done, so that really helped us win the Olympics. We're involved at the competition stage to win the bid for London. We won the bid, which is fantastic. Obviously, the day after we won the bid was a horrible day in London with the terrorist attacks on London. So that actually changed a lot in the way that we were working for the actual bid and the actual master plan itself. Security became #1 on the kind of priority list of the games. That made the whole thing contract enormously. So one way to make things safer and easier to secure is to reduce, bring everything inside a kind of strong perimeter. So that had a big impact on the way that the games worked. Everything got much more serious then. thing. I mean, one of the funny things before we actually won the games was the fact that everyone we met didn't really believe that we'd get it. So we were kind of constantly faced with people saying, well, what are you bothering for? You won't win anyway. But actually it sort of strangely helped us, because they didn't really care. They thought it was quite funny that we were going off and doing all this work and investigating all these things. So they kind of let us sort of, do things without really worrying about it, because they really did not believe we were going to win it. But of course, when we did win it, everyone went, oh my God, now we've actually got to do this. And so, the government and the LDA particularly then had to then start basically commencing land assembly, so actually getting a lot of the land, buying a lot of the land up from private landowners, which was a huge task, hugely expensive task as well. We then, because the plan changed so much away from the initial planning application, it then warranted another planning application, so we had to do another 2 planning applications, one for Olympic and one for Legacy. Luckily the 4 boroughs had got together to create a sort of singular planning entity to now look at these applications, made up of officers from all 4 boroughs. So that made that process a little bit more straightforward. So that was really in the second phase, was looking at that Olympic, looking at that second Olympic and Legacy planning application. We also did additional landscape work to try and get some more certainty on costing and begin to develop a scheme. And then our focus then moved more towards Legacy, as the kind of detailed design teams and a lot of the architects were procured for doing the detail work for a lot of the buildings and infrastructure work. Well, we were actually given a very, very large piece of land to sort of place the Olympics in somewhere, and there was a loose brief about how many venues and buildings there should be. There should be a main stadium, which is obviously the biggest venue of them all. Aquatics was in there, which was the second biggest venue usually in the Olympic Games, and then it was more about what the site and what the transport system could actually support in terms of sort of Olympic venues and components of the Olympics. So we really had an area that ran all the way from the bottom of Hackney Marshes all the way down to the Thames and right out to sort of the kind of community edges of the Lower Lee Valley. We pretty quickly realised that we'd had to focus the Olympics around Stratford, mainly because of the transport connections. It's got superior transport connections, and also, strangely enough, it was one of the other biggest planning applications in the country was sitting around that, which is Westfield and what is now the Olympic Village. So we kind of piggybacked slightly on their application and took the residential component of that application and turned that into the Olympic Village. So that was kind of one of the reasonings why the Olympics is where it is. It also had the benefit of not kind of taking the rest of the Lower Lee Valley out of the picture for another 4 years. You remember that it takes so long to build the Olympics. It's kind of a black hole in London whilst it's being built, but it meant that the lower part of the Lower Lee Valley was still open for a generation and could move effectively. It also relied on a lot of big changes to public transport. So the CTRL rail box, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link station coming into service and coming into kind of more of a local service, changes to the DLR, and just general changes to the whole transport network. So that was the big move for moving it north. Yeah, I think, well, it's one of the hardest places you could put an Olympic Games, really, in London. I mean, I think, although it was one of the last available sites really to actually have the Games, it's a lot of the physical constraints really in terms of railway lines, infrastructure that runs over it or on it or underneath it. So that you've got Northern Outfall sewer that runs across the whole thing, taking all the sewage from North London. You've got 42-inch Victorian lead, or I don't know, cast iron water mains running down one side of it that it's very difficult to do any works around. You've got a whole host, I think 5.5 kilometres of waterways and canals that run through the whole thing. You've got quite a lot of flooding issues, huge amounts of ground contamination, just to name a few, and then also layering on top of that the aspirations for Legacy meant that it was an incredibly complex thing to put within this site. But I think equally the Olympics was one of the only things that would actually allow this regeneration to happen. When we came to the site and we did a study of all the work that had been done around that area, I think we counted 22 master plans that had been done for various bits and pieces around that area. None of them have been realised, purely because it was such an expensive site for any one developer to actually look at and develop, that it was, you know, it needed the Olympics to actually change that place and turn it upside down. In terms of history, I think it's sort of pick your history really, because the site has been subject to huge human interventions throughout its entire history. So it's very difficult to kind of pick any one thing. I mean, arguably, I use the argument always of the waterways. The waterways are first modified for agrarian landscapes of growing food and irrigation and drainage. They were then modified again for tidal mills that ran, you know, north-south, up and down the valley. They were then modified again to move, you know, for putting locks in and making it navigable for the industry to actually move a lot of the goods around. And then again, when the industry left, it was modified yet again for the flood alleviation and things like that. So it's had a real potted history, and I think that the thing that really talks about the history the most is the waterways, effectively. You know, the waterways, the old beautiful concrete walls that run around the canal systems, the locks, and the fact that the whole scheme reveals those waterways is probably the greatest historical asset that site has. We worked quite a lot with the engineering. So Arup and Atkins were the sort of North and South Park engineers, and they typically have quite an advanced program in terms of getting that infrastructure, and so much had to be done underground in terms of utilities, so much had to be done in terms of the bridges. There's so many bridges on the site, all the abutments had to be designed. So we started working with the engineers on the infrastructure effectively and the design of that. So it wasn't really it's a design-led approach, not an engineer-led approach. And then from there, I suppose our shift, we looked at landscape. We looked at landscape at one point in the master plan, and then we also began to look at legacy in much more detail as well. So again, it was that cross-referencing between the legacy condition, which was constantly emerging as we consulted more, heavily with the local boroughs, and then checking back to the Olympics to see how the Olympics could sort of service that legacy condition. Well, I think a lot of the work that we did set up the key principles of the landscape. So one of the you can see, with landscape architects being involved in the leadership of the process, and I think one of the key things there was understanding the wider context, understanding the Lee Valley Park, and the idea that the Lee Valley, or the Queen Elizabeth Park as it's called now, is actually an extension of that, of an existing park system, and there's still more work to be done to kind of drive that down to the Thames. I think we set up the sort of principles of the upper and lower level landscapes. We set up the principles of the conversion into legacy, of the kind of more the ecologically led approach towards the landscape. But as we, again, we liaised with them in terms of the legacy condition and the overall design. But there was a kind of, at some point there was a kind of, we began to sort of stay strategic, and they started looking into more detail. Overall, the master planning process, I'd say, is about between 4 and 5 years for the Olympics, and then obviously the master planning process is still ongoing with a lot of legacy work, although the applications are in now. So it's about 4 to 5 years, I would say. I think I don't know if it does actually. I'd argue that there's that all the key principles that we set up at the beginning of the project are still there. I think it depends how you look. The detail's slightly different. I think when we did some of our landscape work, there was 2 more venues in the park, so that demanded a very different concourse layouts and so on. But I think the key principles are all still there. I'd argue that actually it's very, very similar. And I think, when I present this project to a lot of people, you can actually go through the master plans all the way from 2003 all the way to now, and yes, some of the components have moved around, but all the key kind of pieces, the main pieces, are in the same position. If anything, the reason that I've kind of also already mentioned really why it changed a little bit, which is it contracted. It became small as possible. One, to try and minimise buying land and that land assembly task, it contracted to try and reduce the security issues, so to have more things in a smaller fence effectively to make that more secure. But really, again, I'd say the principles are very similar, especially in the landscape in terms of opening up rivers, the upper and lower level landscape, the ecological approach to the whole thing, and also the legacy, legacy alignment of components. Those big bridges at the top of the park that run east-west are actually designed to go and continue and link up with roads and connections that go beyond the edges of our site. So a lot of those things were in a way fixed by the parameters of the surrounding of the site. Well, security is by its nature slightly secretive, and so there was a small group of people in the team. We had security experts on our side of the team as well, who would then meet with MI5 or whoever in the security services of the government to discuss the level of threats, what they thought, where they thought the threat might be coming from, or where there might be weak points physically within the plan that could be open for attack or whatever. So it was dealt with kind of almost behind the scenes, slightly on a much smaller group, to make sure there was no issue of any of that information getting out into the open. But that would then be fed back into our design work. So I mean, one of the key things that did change, for instance, was the velodrome. The velodrome location used to be in Eaton Manor, north of the M11 Link Road. That then flipped down to be south because it was seen as quite a high target and slightly out of the park, with a public road that ran very close to it. So that was one of the key elements like that. So things began to move around. You may have seen as well they had sort of torpedo nets in the river and things like that to stop anyone being able to kind of swim underneath and into the park. So there's some quite high quite high level of security there. Yeah, a lot of it would go. It's not really appropriate to have bomb blast walls everywhere and very high fences. It doesn't make a great community. I think obviously legacy sort of security turns into sort of a safety issue in the legacy condition, to make sure you have clear, safe routes and there's the right levels of lighting and overlooking from the development. And a lot of that will rely on the finished sort of legacy master plan. I think the biggest challenge for the park is going to be the sort of transformation period. So the next sort of 5-10 years, when you have a big public park in the middle of some building sites, some finished pieces of city, is going to be the most challenging time, and it's really down to the legacy company to ensure there's a real sense of activity and sense of place there going forward. One innovation is having a landscape architecture firm lead a big master planning process like this. Co-location of a team, so forget who you work for, try and turning a bunch of kind of consultants and of top class architects, landscape architects, planners, and turn them into almost a joint venture really to actually do this and deliver this. I think one thing that arguably it's talked about a lot, but it's legacy. I think we did a big study of all the previous Olympic Games to really understand what we perceived about those games in terms of how successful the games were, but also how successful the legacy was. And I think that's something that London's taken to the next level in a way. Actually, the buildings only stay if there's really clear uses for them, and the ones that don't have a business case go, and they're demountable. And there's an honesty, I think, in the games about that. The bridge decks, half the bridge decks are removed in legacy condition to make the bridges a much more human scale and to stop the overshadowing of the river systems. I think there's a fantastic amount of work being done that you don't see. All the utilities and services underground are all built to fit the legacy demand. There's a power station on site as well, which delivers a lot of the cooling and heating to those buildings. So I think that's a big leap forward, and also, there was a huge amount of work that had to be done in terms of remediation of that site. Incredibly difficult site to develop without that level of remediation on such a site-wide scale. So I think also the joint planning committee as well from the former boroughs was an innovation. It wouldn't have it wouldn't have happened without that. So yeah, I could go on really, but there's a lot. I think the four boroughs was tricky at first. I think the fact that we had an ever-changing client group, so it went from the LDA to London 2012 to the ODA and then aspects of LOCOG and now the legacy company. So the constantly changing client was was difficult to deal with. You didn't have that continuity of people that you were always dealing with. I think the complexity of trying to align legacy conditions with the Olympic conditions were quite difficult as well. And it's a tricky site, so the idea, the physical constraints of the site meant it was difficult to fit a lot of the elements in. And there's a lot of innovations in some of the buildings as well to actually get them to fit on the site. The Olympics, the main stadium, for instance, is on a very constrained site, surrounded on three sides by water. So that had to be sort of squeezed as much as it possibly could, and that's why a lot of its concessions sort of popped out of the building and ended up to be actually on that island site. So that sort of the whole island was conceived as the stadium in a way. So I think that coupled with really the landscape at the heart of the whole thing was a fantastic idea, and the idea that we focused the landscape around the river systems as the permanent landscape, and then the kind of permanent landscape would then grow away from those river systems was a great innovation, but equally challenging. All the flood modelling that had to be done as well. So the flood modelling drove the soffit heights of the bridges, which then drove the levels across the site. So there's a very complex relationship between water, the site levels, the building fronts to make it all accessible. Another challenge to make the whole thing accessible as much as possible was difficult to get all the levels to work between the buildings, the bridges, and then to take people up over land bridges, over the railway lines in the middle of the site, and obviously over the main roads to the north as well. That was tricky to get it to work. I cut my teeth on this project really. It was 10 years ago, well, almost 10 years ago when I started working on this project. So it threw me in the deep end a lot of the time. I was given a lot of challenging assignments to do, either go and present to certain people or to go and speak to various organisations at a relatively young age, and trying to communicate very complex issues. I remember, for instance, once going to see the head of the Channel Tunnel Rail Link project. No, sorry, the Crossrail project, and say, well, we want to put the main stadium there. He's going, well, no, you can't put that there because that's where all our staging is for the tunnel that we're building. And then having those kind of conversations, it's just incredible learning experience for me to actually be put in those positions, and also in terms of presenting and having to present to a lot of people. A lot of very senior people as well, the ideas on the project. As we were quite a small group of people that had to be kind of spread quite thinly across the whole thing. It taught me a lot about politics, and the politics not only of projects but politics within London, and how you get things done and the way that you deal with people. And again, a lot of it's about relationships. So I think that was a big growing experience for me. I think co-locating and working with other disciplines is something that I learn a huge amount from, and I suppose it's turned me into a sort of bit of a jack of all trades really, master of none. It's just kind of the idea that you can, and being a very open sort of working relationship where you're not afraid to have opinions on engineering or architecture or anything like that has been very liberating. And now I find it very hard to work in the sort of old-fashioned way where you still got to phone people up and set meetings up. So that kind of speed of working is something actually in a way AECOM have tried, are now working on doing internally, is actually having everyone mixed together, so there's no sort of breakdown of this sort of studio mentality, so that you're working with different disciplines. I think it's obviously been incredibly rewarding to sort of finally go out to the Olympics and see the whole thing there. It's actually I found it difficult to take in at first, after having worked on something for so long, and then it be built. You think usually in master plans actually you're not going to see it built for 20 years or something, where you actually see this built, and that's very, very rewarding. So that was one of my probably greatest accomplishments, is having been part of it, really, just being part of that team. From my point of view, I learned a lot about the planning process in this country, and how important planning is, and how you need to understand the planning system if you really want to get the most out of your project. I'm blessed with having a great planning team in the office that I work in, so I sort of rely on them for a lot of the kind of work, but actually I still have a kind of very good and useful understanding of the planning process and the system, and to some extent how it can be manipulated to your benefit. I learned a lot about politics and how big projects get built, and how big projects work, and how the different personalities within the project, the client group, how the politics within the kind of smaller group of consultants work, but also how you have to interact with the politics of a city, really, in order to deliver these big projects. I learnt a lot about presenting. I learned a lot about how the best way to explain incredibly complex projects. We kind of go back to say, well, how would you explain it to your grandmother? You have to start with a really simple idea that then can be expanded upon. But if you can't start with that simple idea and take everyone with you, you're not going to succeed. I think I learned a lot about being ambitious as well, and being confident. I think we had a very great can-do attitude, which is very, in a way, un-British, in the beginnings of the project, where we just had a sort of sense of belief that we could actually do it and win it for London, which is great. We were going to see people and they were saying, well, you won't win it, why are you bothering? So, well, no, we will. And that was contagious somehow. So that actually really helped us kind of go through, all those really long late nights and all those sort of things. That really helped us through the whole process. So it was a kind of, it's very difficult to pick one thing that I learned, because it was a huge kind of, growing experience for me, in every aspect and every part of the discipline. I think, well, it wasn't just, there was a group of landscape architects on the project. I think the ability to see the bigger picture sometimes, to actually be able to kind of look at the whole piece, not only the whole piece sort of geographically, but the whole piece in terms of time, and understanding the need to design with time, understanding the importance and the impact that landscape can have on projects, and how you organise differently a master plan based around landscape principles. So I think that really brought something to the process, and I also believe that landscape architects are very good at. We're quite friendly people, really. We're quite good at working with other people and not being too precious. Being precious when we need to be, but allowing other people to kind of say their piece and work with them, and work well with other consultants and other disciplines is I think one of our greatest assets and our greatest skills. But equally, when we need to dig our heels in, we should be able to dig our heels in and be very confident about that. I think, well, landscape architects can take the lesson that we are capable of leading big projects and adding a lot of value to them. I think there's a lot to be said about the teamwork that landscape architects have been involved in this as well. I think we all talk about LDA Hargreaves, and they've done a fantastic job, but also there's a number of other landscape architects that are involved in Vote in the Olympic Village, or HED around the main stadium. So I think it's been a really great kind of piece of team working, and we shouldn't be afraid to kind of team up when we need to. I think you've got to realise that no one firm could have ever delivered something at this scale and this complexity. So the team working for me is incredibly important, and the ability to lead these projects, we shouldn't shy away from. There's quite a few lessons to learn from London. We've already had the IOC come in and tell us what they think of London in terms of the good points and the bad points. I think every host city will add their own elements to the games. But there are some core principles that they can take from London. One is getting organised early. That's incredibly important, and London was very good at that. They also, I think London have paid huge attention to detail, not only in the kind of the physical Olympic part, but in the sort of procurement of the volunteers, and the whole kind of picture was dealt with very, very well. Obviously the legacy story, I think, is something that can be taken away, and really, being really honest about what needs to stay and what needs to go, and not falling into the trap of wanting icons but not actually having anything to do with them afterwards. But that's about an honesty. Other countries may want to do that differently, so it's also, you can't just take the London model and apply it to another country. It's a very difficult balance. Well, I think the hopes of the park are that it's the centre of a fantastic new community, within London. I'd also like to see the park unlock a bigger landscape idea of really unlocking the Lee Valley Park and the whole kind of green grid network as well, so that it's not just a park on itself, but it's actually a bigger extension to a park. And there's also a lot of work being done on that link that then goes from the sort of bottom of the Queen Elizabeth Park down to the Thames. So I'd like to see that kind of impetus and that energy kind of continue and deliver those other kind of key pieces of infrastructure and connectivity of the parklands. I'd like to see it, a thriving place. I want to see the ecology thriving there, and the river systems and everything become much more mature. But obviously there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Without the Olympics, the energy isn't necessarily there, so we need to build a legacy and make sure we do that. And also in the interim, we need to make sure there's a really strong transformation sort of process in place, so that there's a whole host of activities that continue within the park, some sporting, some more entertainment based. There's already the next sort of tranche of landscape architects and designers getting involved with field operations, doing the South Park area and the North Hub as well. That's going in, community building up there and playground. So there's still all of that needs to come in. I want to, I just want it to be a thriving place and not go off. The fear is that we live in a very impatient society, and 2 years down the line, why isn't it finished yet? It's going to take time. So we need to make sure that there's a really good transformation process there. I think King's Cross is doing a really good job right now in terms of turning it into a place before its place. Granary Square's in, they've got a whole host of events going on. People go up there, so there's a lot of that transformation thing is my biggest fear, but I think it's also one of the biggest opportunities. I think landscape architects brought a sense of, well, obviously there's a sense of how much landscape can help to structure a piece of city, but not in a complicated way, in a very simple way. The idea of focusing a park around the river systems and extending the Lee Valley Park was key to kind of the whole master plan. You can see that right from the first master plan through to the finished design. I think we brought a sense of collaboration that you might not get with other professions that I think we're very good at, and also a kind of understanding of the broader context, I would argue as well. You're looking way beyond the boundaries of our site to make sure that what we're proposing has as much benefit reaching far beyond those, and breaking down these barriers, sort of the physical barriers of railway lines and canals that actually exist on the site. So the positioning of social infrastructure and schools at the edge of the site to make sure they actually catchments go beyond the boundaries of the site, for instance, are one example of that. And I think also seeing opportunities in terms of ecology, and ecology being at the forefront of the design as well was something that only landscape architects could really bring. I think going actually and seeing the master plan built, walking into the site for the first time was it's actually a very moving experience. You know, it was kind of to see everyone very happy and to, you know, and then finally go through all the games. And I was kind of in a way nervous. I was hoping nothing would go wrong during the games, and there was, you know, it was flawless, and it was better than I think all of us imagined it would be. So to see everyone so happy was surely the greatest achievement of what we did. We have a similar involvement, but it's a bit more in depth this time. Again, we went in for a competition to win the master plan of Barra, which is actually the main part within Rio, but there's a number of satellite sort of complexes around Rio. So it was really to master plan the biggest one, which is the Barra site, which has the majority of the stadiums in it. But our role now will be much more in depth. So you know, we're not EDOR anymore. We're now AECOM. AECOM's a much bigger firm. We have a very big engineering group, very big sports architecture group now, as well as landscape architects and master planners. So we're actually looking at the whole package and going through into much more detail in terms of landscape and sports architecture and infrastructure. They're up against it. I won't, you know, say that, but I think they have got quite a few of the venues built. The main stadium is the Maracanã, which is already there. Our site actually has 2 venues on it as well. So they are, you know, they've got a lot of work to do. You've got to remember here as well, they've also got to deliver the World Cup in 2 years' time. So they're going to be pretty busy out there. But I think they don't have a planning process like ours, so it's much quicker to get some of these things through that process. But you know, I won't lie to you, they've got a lot of work to do in a very short space of time. There's one thing sort of designing the Olympic Games, imagining how it's going to work, and then it happens. And I've learned so much over the last, you know, 8 weeks with the Olympic and Paralympic Games on, you know, having access to see how all these things function. I've learned almost more over the last 8 weeks than I have over the last 8 years in some ways, because actually designing it and seeing it actually in practice is incredible, and how it as a sort of machine works. You know, it's incredibly ordered you know, thing that has to happen during games time in terms of processing of people, crowd movement, crowd flow, how the common domain, how the front of house works, how the back of house of each venue works, and how the servicing and access works behind that as well. So I think now you know, we know a lot more about that, and every single games has an innovation in that as well. You know, technology moves on, ticketing, speed of ticketing, and security changes, and all these technological things advance. So I think we can take a lot of what London has done to Rio, but we also have to, in some senses, imagine the leaps in technology that's going to happen as well, in terms of how you know, what innovations, you know, technology brings to the games. I mean, you know, we kind of do role play this a little bit in the office as well, because there's, you know, the live site, for instance, was incredibly popular in the middle of the Olympic Park in London Olympics. But of course, when you consider that a lot of people aren't British who go there, and all they can watch is the British athletes, it's kind of, what, you know, interesting. So they would actually prefer to see their own athletes. So everyone's got an iPad and they can just watch it. You know, and that couldn't happen in the Olympic Park in London, but could it happen in Rio? If it's got very, very good Wi-Fi, you know, G4 connectivity or whatever, it means that you know, everyone can actually watch different channels on their various players, and not have to go to the live site and see their own team, you know, play. And so there's sort of thinking around that and technology. I think there's always a big drive to sort of compress as much as possible the land take of the Olympics, because it's very land hungry in terms of all of its servicing. You know, I think every venue needs almost 200% of its actual footprint in sort of front of house and back of house servicing. So how can that be compressed down to make it more efficient? Is it all really needed? And so there's kind of a whole process of rethinking everything as well. And I think there's a danger that you just say, oh, we'll do it like London, but actually, you know, a lot's going to happen in the next 4 years in terms of technology. So that's one thing that we need to keep abreast of effectively. For me, there's a danger that you take one games and you just apply it everywhere. Whereas you've got to, one, there's technological changes and the way that we live our lives and the way that we expect, you know, more data, and everyone's going to carry it. You know, if everyone's carrying iPhones around now, what are they going to be doing in 4 years' time? So there's the kind of changes to the game. How do the games change from, you know, each one? The innovations there, but also there's the cultural. There's the kind of cultural side of things about how each culture wants to apply itself to the games and make it their own. You know, Britain made the games their own. It was the British game, wasn't it, by a million billion miles. But and I think, you know, the Brazilians will make it theirs as well. What that means, I don't know. I mean, every venue is very land hungry in terms of the servicing area it's required. Especially, I mean, if you think, especially temporary venues, where temporary venues don't tend to have the concessions and toilets and things like that in the building because they're temporary, so they all sort of pop out onto the front of house concourse. That just extends the amount of space that they're required. I think other elements that, you know, that we're learning about as well is that there's a huge increase in data transfer between, say, you know, Athens and Beijing was 20% more, and Beijing, London 30% more. So what's Rio? And all of that requires huge amounts of extra technology that we have to embed into the you know, into the landscape, into the master plan, into the buildings. No, I think there. Looking around the Olympic Park, I thought it was a fantastic success. I think one of the highlights for me were, you know, the wildflowers and the way that just gave enormous amount of impact for very little cost in a way was very, very clever. I think the live site was fantastic. It could have been 5 times bigger, you know, in terms of its success. It was, you know, almost a victim of its own success somehow, but that's not really a criticism. I think it was a fantastic sort of set piece to the north of the park, and the setting was amazing. I suppose there was a lot of back of house on show, which is a sort of a shame in a way. But then there's sort of so much sort of visual sort of stuff going on. It kind of takes your eye off it. There's so much to look at. But I think there was some bits of the sort of, you were looking, say, from the 2012 Gardens right at the back of house of, say, water polo, which is a bit of a shame. But you know, it didn't really detract from the process. I mean, I suppose I'm walking around being too critical, really. But I think, you know, overall it was just a fantastic experience to see it all built there. I think we were lucky with the weather, and I think I had a few people complaining there's no shelter either from the sun or when it did rain. There was nowhere to go in terms of the rain, but we were like, you know, it's fine. You know, it's not a problem. So, I mean, these are all things that we need to sort of take away to Rio now and examine further. But we have a very different climate. To be honest, it'll be in the middle of winter in Rio as well, but it will either be very hot or it'll be raining very hard. So, you know, we need to kind of, the park and the landscape within Rio needs to respond to that more. And I think the other thing is I'm learning a lot from the industry, the landscape industry, say in Brazil is incredibly different than it is here in Europe. You know, in Europe we're blessed with some of the best tree growers in the world sitting on our doorstep in, you know, Belgium and Holland and you know, northern France and Germany. Whereas in Brazil, in a climate like that, you don't tend to get trees very big. You know, you tend to get them, you plant them small, they grow very, very fast. So we're trying to understand the industry there. Same with hard landscape. You know, where does all this material come from? What are they good at? So there's a huge learning curve there in terms of that, and we're looking at partnering with Brazilian firms to help us understand that.